After years of being mistreated, I was let go, but I smiled, knowing I'd expose everything on Friday. The first cracks of dawn hadn't even broken through the Manhattan skyline when I slid my keycard into Raskin Tech's main entrance. The security guard, Hector, 52, 3 grandkids, and a passion for fantasy football, barely looked up from his crossword puzzle. He didn't need to. For 8 years, 9 months, and 17 days, I'd been the first one to arrive and the last to leave. "Morning, Miss Morris," he mumbled automatically. "Morning, Hector. Giants lost again?" He finally glanced up, the surprise in his eyes telling me everything I needed to know. 8 years of mourning and changes, and he still seemed shocked that I remembered details about his life. "Yeah, tough season," he replied before returning to his puzzle. I smiled thinly and continued toward the elevator. This was my existence at Raskin Tech. I was Lena Morris, present enough to be useful, invisible enough to be forgotten. The administrative assistant who knew how everyone took their coffee, who remembered birthdays, who could conjure up last-minute presentation materials like a magician pulling rabbits from a hat. They treated me like furniture, quiet, unseen, always available. The 17th floor was still dark when I arrived. I flipped on the lights, listening to the gentle hum as the office slowly came to life around me. My routine never varied. First, I'd start the coffee machines. Regular in the communal kitchen, special Colombian blend in the executive suite. Then I'd review the day's schedule, check for any overnight emails from international clients, and prepare the conference rooms for morning meetings. By 7:30 a.m., I'd already accomplished more than most would in their entire day, but that wasn't what made me valuable. What made me valuable was what I knew. I knew that marketing director Jim Calloway was having an affair with someone in accounting. I knew that the Q3 projections had been deliberately inflated to please investors. I knew that the revolutionary software update scheduled for next month had critical bugs that nobody was addressing. I knew everything because I was nothing. A ghost drifting through hallways, sitting silently in corners during meetings, processing documents that nobody bothered to shield from my eyes. "Lena, there you are." I looked up from my desk to see Meredith Chen, VP of Product Development, rushing toward me with that particular look of panic I'd come to recognize so well. "The Access proposal presentation, please tell me it's ready. Daniel wants to review it before the 9 a.m. Daniel Kirkland, the CEO who'd walked past my desk at least 3,000 times and still couldn't quite remember my name. "It's finished," I said calmly, pulling up the file on my computer. I stayed late to incorporate the latest data points and fixed the inconsistencies in the growth projections. Relief washed over Meredith's face. "You're a lifesaver. Seriously." What she didn't say: "Thank you for doing Bradley's work when he couldn't be bothered to finish his own presentation." Again, Bradley Thompson, executive VP, who earned 7 figures while I earned barely enough to afford my 1-bedroom apartment in Queens. "Just doing my job," I replied with a practiced smile. As the office filled with people, the familiar ache settled in my chest. I watched them arrive in their designer clothes, laughing about weekend plans, completely unaware of the woman who'd prepared their meeting rooms, ensured their presentations were error-free, and made sure the right kind of sparkling water was stocked in the refrigerator. In the weekly strategy meeting at 10 a.m., I sat in my usual corner chair, notebook in hand. Nobody acknowledged me as I entered. Why would they? I was just there to take notes, to remember action items that others would forget, to send follow-up emails that would make executives look competent. "Incredible work on the Access proposal, Bradley," Daniel said, clapping the EVP on the shoulder. The visuals were particularly impressive. Bradley, who had contributed exactly nothing to the presentation I'd spent 14 hours perfecting, beamed. "Just trying to elevate our game, Danny." I felt nothing as I watched this exchange. The initial sting of such blatant credit stealing had faded years ago. Now it was just part of the atmosphere at Raskin Tech, like the too cold air conditioning or the faint smell of burnt coffee that perpetually haunted the break room. When the company restructured last year, bringing in new management, I thought things might change. They did. They got worse. The new COO, Victoria Raskin, daughter of the founder, had a particular talent for making me feel even more invisible. "You," she'd say, snapping her fingers when she couldn't bother to recall my name. "We need coffee in the hummingbird room. The good stuff, not the swill from the kitchen. Today was no different. As the meeting progressed, I meticulously recorded every decision, every assignment, every subtle power play. When Bradley stumbled over a question about implementation timelines, his eyes found mine across the room. I slid the relevant document toward him with a discreet nod. He presented the information as if it had been at the forefront of his mind all along. Later, as I refilled water pitchers during a break, I overheard Daniel and Victoria in the hallway. "We need to talk about the admin situation," Victoria was saying in hushed tones, particularly Morris. "Who?" Daniel asked. "The mouse girl. Always lurking." "Oh, right. What about her?" "My niece graduates next month. Business degree from Cornell. She needs a place to start, and I've been thinking." Their voices faded as they walked away, but the message was clear. After nearly a decade of invisible service, I was about to be replaced by nepotism in its purest form. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I wasn't just Lena Morris, the forgettable administrative assistant who could magically produce any file at a moment's notice. I was Lena Morris, daughter of Jonathan Morris, one of Raskin Tech's earliest angel investors, the quiet heiress to a connection that gave me far more power than anyone in that building could possibly imagine. And as I watched them plotting my dismissal over imported sparkling water that I had ordered, I felt something unfamiliar stir within me. Not fear, not anger, anticipation. The rain pelted against my apartment windows as I nursed a glass of Merlot, staring at the wooden chest I rarely opened. Tonight felt different. Tonight, with the thunder rolling across Queens and the weight of impending dismissal on my shoulders, I needed the reminder of who I truly was. I unlocked the ornate box, my father's last gift to me, and pulled out the leather portfolio inside. The documents were still crisp, protected from time by both legal precision and my careful handling. My fingers traced over the embossed letterhead of Morris & Associates, my father's firm, before settling on the words that had changed everything. Blind Trust Agreement, Raskin Technology Incorporated. "They thought I was nobody," I whispered to the empty room. "They didn't know I owned part of the floor they worked on." My father, Jonathan Morris, had been many things: brilliant financial advisor, shrewd investor, loving but distant parent, but what he excelled at most was playing the long game. When Thomas Raskin approached him in 2002, looking for capital to launch his tech venture, my father saw potential where others saw risk. He became one of Raskin Tech's earliest angel investors, quietly acquiring a significant stake in the company before anyone realized what it would become. What he couldn't have predicted was his diagnosis 4 years later. Pancreatic cancer, terminal. The memory of our last meaningful conversation still burned bright. I'd been 24, fresh out of business school, eager to make my mark. "The world doesn't reward the loudest voice in the room, Lena," he'd told me. Oxygen tube nestled beneath his nose. "It rewards the patient observer, the one who understands how the pieces move before making their play." He died 3 weeks later, leaving behind a modest estate, and as I would discover during the reading of his will, a 7% ownership stake in Raskin Tech, placed in a blind trust with my name on it. The trust had specific conditions. I would have no voting rights for 15 years, allowing the company to grow without interveners. The shares would remain anonymous, listed under the trust's name rather than mine. And most importantly, I was prohibited from revealing my connection to anyone associated with the company during that period. "Why?" I'd asked the executor, baffled by these restrictions. "Your father believed in first-hand knowledge," the gray-haired lawyer had explained. "His note says you're to seek employment there if you wish to understand what you'll eventually help guide." And so, armed with an administrative degree and my father's cryptic instructions, I'd applied for an entry-level position at Raskin Tech. I'd expected to stay a year or two, learning the company from the ground up before moving on to something more suitable for someone with my education. I never expected to become invisible. I never expected to witness such systematic dysfunction. And I certainly never expected to stay for almost a decade, watching the company culture deteriorate as profits soared. I pulled another document from the portfolio, a calendar notification from Prescott and Wainwright, the trust administrators. The date circled in red, April 17, 2024. 3 days from now, after 15 years, my proxy voting rights would finally activate. For the first time, I would have a voice at the shareholder table. The timing couldn't have been more perfect or more ironic. The memory of last month's board meeting floated to the surface. I'd been stationed in my usual corner, invisible as always, when board member Eleanor Hughes had questioned Daniel's leadership. "The employee satisfaction surveys are concerning," she'd noted, pointing to the data I'd compiled and organized. "Turnover has increased 47% in the past 2 years." Daniel had dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. "People are replaceable. What matters is profit margins, and those are healthier than ever." What he hadn't seen was the quiet exchange of glances between Eleanor and James Fitzpatrick, the board's longest-serving member. I had cataloged that moment, along with dozens of others over the years, in my mental repository of corporate drama. While they mocked me and dumped grunt work on my desk, I was building relationships with the quieter, more principled members of the board. A question here about their grandchildren. A helpful note there about an upcoming vote. Small gestures that formed genuine connections they didn't even realize were significant. I'd spent years studying the company bylaws, understanding exactly how power flowed through Raskin Tech. I knew which board members were Daniel's puppets and which ones had begun questioning his leadership. I knew which executives fudged their expense reports and which ones abused their subordinates. I knew every skeleton in every corporate closet. I never planned to use this knowledge. Despite everything, I believed in what Raskin Tech could be. My father had invested in the company's potential, not its corruption. I had hoped things would improve naturally, that better leadership would emerge, that my voting rights would simply be a formality when the time came. But as I sipped my wine and stared at the calendar, something hardened inside me. The conversation I'd overheard between Daniel and Victoria played on repeat in my mind. The mouse girl, always lurking. I placed the documents back in the chest and walked to my small home office. The wall above my desk was covered with notes, articles, and photos, a detective's board tracking Raskin Tech's descent. Emails I'd printed showing ethics violations, timelines of suspicious product launches, organizational charts highlighting qualified employees pushed out to make room for friends and family of the executive team. For years, I'd been collecting evidence without fully understanding why. Now I knew this wasn't just about my imminent dismissal. This was about justice for everyone who'd been stepped on, everyone whose ideas had been stolen, everyone who'd been replaced because they weren't part of the right circle. My phone buzzed with a calendar alert. HR meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. The end was coming, just as I'd overheard. The perfect corporate execution, timed just days before I would have had a voice. But they didn't know what I knew. They couldn't see what was coming. I opened my laptop and began typing an email to the board secretary, confirming my attendance at Friday's annual shareholder meeting. Then I drafted another email to Eleanor Hughes and James Fitzpatrick, attaching just enough evidence to pique their interest, marked with the subject line, "For Friday's consideration." They thought I was replaceable furniture. They were about to learn I was the foundation. The Westmore presentation was a disaster waiting to happen. And everyone knew it. Everyone except Bradley Thompson, who was supposed to deliver it. Westmore Industries represented our biggest potential client of the year, a $50 million contract that would either cement Raskin Tech's reputation as an industry leader or expose us as frauds. I'd spent the past 3 weeks gathering data, creating slides, and refining talking points for a presentation. Bradley had barely glanced at. This morning, he'd strode in wearing last night's suit, reeking of whiskey and panic. "Lena," he'd hissed, leaning over my desk. "I need the Westmore deck, now." I'd handed him the presentation packet, complete with talking points color-coded and highlighted for his convenience. "Everything's prepared. Just follow." Yeah, he'd cut me off, snatching the folder. "Coffee. Conference room. Make it strong." The Westmore executives, 5 of them in immaculate suits, had arrived promptly at 10 a.m. By 10:15, I knew Bradley was bombing. From my position by the refreshment table, I watched him fumble through slides I'd carefully organized, skipping crucial information, misquoting statistics I'd triple verified. When Harold Westmore, the silver-haired CEO, asked about implementation timelines, Bradley had frozen, sweat beading on his forehead. That's when I'd done something unprecedented. I'd stepped forward. "If I may," I'd said quietly, setting down the coffee carafe. The implementation schedule is detailed on slide 17, which we seem to have skipped. The room had gone silent. Bradley's eyes had widened in horror at my interruption, but I'd continued, assing the presentation to the correct slide. As you can see, we've developed a phased approach that minimizes disruption to your existing systems while allowing for incremental validation at each milestone. For the next 10 minutes, I'd guided the conversation, answering questions with precision, connecting dots that Bradley had left scattered. The Westmore team had leaned forward, engaged. Harold had nodded approvingly. When I'd finished returning to my corner, Daniel had smoothly taken over, praising our team's thorough approach. By meeting's end, Westmore had verbally committed to the partnership. "We'll have contracts drawn up immediately," Daniel had beamed, shaking hands all around. After the Westmore team departed, I'd expected at least a grudging acknowledgement. Instead, I'd received stony silence from Bradley and a tight-lipped "my office 3 p.m." from Daniel. Now, seated across from him in the corner office with its panoramic view of Manhattan, I watched Daniel pretend to review my personnel file. Victoria Raskin sat beside him, arms crossed, mouth set in a thin line. Off to the side, Heather from HR tapped nervously on her tablet. "Lena," Daniel finally said, closing the folder. "You've been with us for quite some time." 9 years, 7 months, and 21 days, I supplied. He cleared his throat. "Yes. Well, that's actually what we need to discuss. The company is undergoing some strategic realignments, departmental restructuring," Victoria added with practiced solemnity. I sat very still, waiting for the blow I knew was coming. "Unfortunately," Daniel continued, "we're consolidating several administrative positions. Your role specifically has been identified as redundant in our new organizational structure." The corporate euphemisms were almost poetic in their emptiness. I wondered briefly if they practiced them in front of mirrors, these bloodless phrases designed to disguise simple truths. "You're fired. We don't want you anymore. We found someone prettier, younger, better connected." I see. Victoria leaned forward. "This is in no way a reflection of your performance." The pause before performance said everything she wouldn't. "We're prepared to offer 2 weeks severance," Heather interjected, sliding a document across the desk. "Provided you sign this standard separation agreement, of course." I glanced at the paper, a legal gag order preventing me from disparaging the company or disclosing confidential information. Standard indeed, except for one thing. It would prevent me from speaking freely at Friday's shareholder meeting. "When would my termination be effective?" I asked. "Immediately," Daniel replied with barely concealed relief that I wasn't making a scene. "We'll have it supervise as you collect your personal items." "And my replacement?" I couldn't help asking, though I already knew the answer. Daniel and Victoria exchanged glances. "We've identified a promising candidate with fresh perspective and relevant education," Victoria offered smoothly. "Your niece," I stated. Not a question. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Daniel's practiced compassion hardened into something colder. "Cassandra has a business degree from Cornell," Victoria snapped. "She's more than qualified. For a position you just described as redundant?" I kept my voice even, genuinely curious how they defied the contradiction. Daniel's jaw tightened. "The restructuring is complex. Some roles are being eliminated, others redefined." "I see," I said again, folding my hands in my lap. "Look, Lena," Daniel sighed, dropping the corporate veneer for a moment of startling honesty. "You're reliable. I'll give you that. But this company is evolving. We need people who stand out, who take initiative, who bring something special to the table." "Not everyone can be exceptional," Victoria added, with a dismissive wave. "There's no shame in being replaceable." It wasn't the demotion. It wasn't even the insultingly small severance package. It was the smirk on his face when he told me I was replaceable. As if my very existence was a footnote, easily erased and rewritten. In that moment, something crystallized inside me, a perfect diamond-hard resolve. I picked up the severance agreement and pretended to review it. "May I have until Friday to consider this?" "I'd like my lawyer to look it over." Daniel frowned. "We'd prefer to wrap this up today." "I understand," I said, setting the document down. "But I believe company policy allows employees 3 business days to review separation agreements." It's in the Employee Handbook, Section 47. If I recall correctly. Heather fidgeted uncomfortably. She's right. It's standard procedure. Fine, Daniel relented, clearly annoyed by this minor inconvenience. You have until Friday at half p.m., but we expect you to vacate your desk today. I nodded, rising from my chair with a calm that seemed to unnerve them. They had expected tears, perhaps, begging. The typical response of someone whose world had just collapsed. Instead, I extended my hand to Daniel. Thank you for the opportunity to work at Raskin Tech. He shook it, momentarily confused by my composure. As I turned to leave, I paused at the door. Oh, and congratulations on the Westmore contract. I hope it works out well for everyone involved. I walked out with my head high, past the curious stares of coworkers who'd already heard whispers of my dismissal. At my desk, under the watchful eye of a bored IT specialist, I collected the few personal items I kept at work. A small plant, a framed photo of my father, a coffee mug. What they couldn't know was that I was holding back laughter, not tears. Because they forgot one thing. The shareholder meeting was on Friday, and my name was still on the proxy list. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. My apartment felt different that evening. Smaller somehow, yet filled with possibility. I'd stopped at a liquor store on the way home and splurged on a bottle of Macallan 18, a whiskey my father had favored for celebrations. This qualified. As I poured 2 fingers into a crystal tumbler, another inheritance, my phone buzzed with messages from former colleagues. Most were performative sympathy, so sorry to hear, and their loss from people who had barely acknowledged my existence for years. I ignored them, focusing instead on the 3 emails that mattered. The first was from Charles Wainwright, the trust administrator, confirming that tomorrow, April 17th, my voting rights would formally activate. The second was from Margaret Dixon, the board secretary, acknowledging my attendance at Friday's meeting. The third and most surprising was from Eleanor Hughes. Received your email. Disturbing contents. Can we discuss? Breakfast tomorrow, 7 a.m., Thornton's on. I allowed myself a small smile as I sipped the whiskey. The board meeting was set for Friday at 10 a.m. That gave me less than 48 hours to execute a plan I'd been unconsciously formulating for nearly a decade. My laptop was open on the coffee table, displaying the latest internal numbers from Raskin Tech. The company presented a glossy facade to the public, innovative, profitable, ethically sound, but hidden beneath the surface financials was a different story. Revenue was up 22% year over year, but employee retention had plummeted. The vaunted revolutionary software update was 6 months behind schedule and riddled with security vulnerabilities the development team had been ordered to ignore. Meanwhile, executive compensation had increased by 35% while entry-level salaries remained stagnant. I pulled up a folder labeled iInsurance and began organizing my evidence methodically. The mislabeled expense reports showing Daniel's personal vacations charged to the company, the emails directing HR to crush unionization efforts, the documented instances of harassment complaints against 3 executives that had been buried and settled with NDAs. For years, I'd been the perfect administrative ghost, hearing everything, remembering everything, saying nothing. Now that silence would be weaponized. By midnight, I'd compiled a comprehensive dossier, categorized by infraction, with corresponding bylaws and potential legal violations noted. I encrypted the file and sent a copy to my personal lawyer with instructions to release it to certain journalists if anything happened to me. That might seem paranoid, but I'd seen how Daniel operated when cornered. When the company's former CFO had questioned certain accounting practices 2 years ago, he'd been not only fired but blacklisted throughout the industry, his reputation destroyed by whispers of embezzlement. The next morning, I arrived at Thornton's 15 minutes early, selecting a corner booth with a clear view of the entrance. Eleanor Hughes arrived precisely at 7 a.m., her silver hair impeccably styled, her movements deliberate with the dignity of her 72 years. "Miss Morris," she said, sliding into the booth. "I must admit, I was surprised by your email." "Thank you for coming, Miss Hughes." "Eleanor, please." She studied me with shrewd eyes that had evaluated business propositions for longer than I'd been alive. "I've seen you taking notes in board meetings for years, but I never imagined you had access to this kind of information." I sipped my coffee. Being invisible has its advantages. Clearly, she tapped a manicured finger on the table. These allegations against Daniel and Victoria, they're serious. Potentially criminal in some cases. Every claim is documented, I replied. I've only shown you a fraction of what I have. And what exactly do you want? Lena? Her tone wasn't accusatory, merely practical. I met her gaze steadily. Justice. Accountability. A company that reflects the values my father believed in when he invested. Your father? Her eyebrows rose slightly. I slid a document across the table, the trust certification that would be officially activated today. Eleanor's eyes widened as she read. Jonathan Morris was your father? He was one of our original angels. Yes. And as of today, I control his 7% voting interest. She let out a soft laugh. So that's why you wanted to confirm your attendance at Friday's meeting. Daniel has no idea, does he? None whatsoever. He fired me yesterday. The waiter arrived with our breakfast, and we paused our conversation. When he departed, Eleanor leaned forward. James Fitzpatrick has been concerned about Daniel's leadership for some time, she said quietly. The ward has been divided, but with your evidence and your voting bloc, we could force a confidence vote, I finished. She nodded slowly. It would be unprecedented, but not impossible. She took a bite of her eggs, chewing thoughtfully. Tell me something, Lena. Why wait all these years? You could have revealed your connection to the company at any time. My father believed I needed to understand Raskin Tech from the inside before I could help guide its futures, I explained. He structured the trust to prevent me from having influence until I'd gained that perspective. And he was right. Eleanor studied me with newfound respect. Jonathan always did play the long game. She dabbed her lips with her napkin. I'll speak with James today. If what you've shown me is even half of what you possess, Friday will be eventful. As she left, she paused to squeeze my shoulder. Your father would be proud, Lena. Back at my apartment, I changed into a charcoal gray suit I'd purchased months ago, but never worn, classic expensive, the attire of someone who belonged in a boardroom, not behind a desk arranging other people's schedules. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Chen, Meredith's assistant. Rumors flying. Daniel called emergency exec meeting. Something about Westmore threatening to pull out of deal? I smiled. I'd anticipated this. Yesterday, before leaving, I'd sent a brief factual email to Harold Westmore thanking him for the opportunity to assist with the presentation and informing him of my departure from Raskin Tech. No accusations, no bitterness, just enough to make him question the stability of the company he was about to partner with. Another text arrived, this one from James Fitzpatrick. Meeting with Eleanor. Disturbed by information. Need to talk before Friday. Dinner tonight? The pieces were falling into place faster than I'd expected. Perhaps Daniel sensed something in the air, some shift in the corporate winds. He'd called a press conference for Thursday afternoon, a transparent attempt to solidify his position with a public show of strength before the board meeting. I checked my watch. The official trust activation would be complete within hours. After that, I needed to meet with my lawyer to ensure every detail was in order for Friday. The strangest part of this experience was the profound calm I felt. For nearly a decade, I'd absorbed slights and dismissals, swallowed my pride, and played the role assigned to me. Now, on the brink of revealing my true position, I felt neither anxiety nor vengeful glee, only a quiet certainty that justice was finally at hand. They thought they silenced me. I was just waiting for the right room to speak in. And on Friday morning, that room would be the Raskin Tech boardroom, where for the first time, they would have no choice but to listen. I entered Raskin Tech through the executive lobby, a path I'd never taken before. The security guard checked his list, his eyebrows rising slightly when he found my name. Yes, Ms. Morris. The board meeting is on the 30th floor. How different this felt from my thousands of previous entries. No coffee carrier, no stack of folders, just a slim leather portfolio containing everything I needed to change the company forever. Margaret Dixon, the board secretary, hurried over when she saw me waiting outside the boardroom. Ms. Morris, I'm glad you're here. There's been some confusion about your attendance. What sort of confusion? Mr. Kirkland insisted you be removed from the list. She lowered her voice, but council confirmed your right to attend as a proxy holder. I should warn you though, he's not in a pleasant mood. The Westmore deal is apparently falling apart. I nodded. suppressing a smile. My departure email to Harold Westmore had achieved its purpose. I waited until all board members had entered before making my entrance. The boardroom fell silent as I walked in. 12 faces registering various degrees of confusion. Daniel sat at the head of the table, his expression darkening when he saw me. "This is a closed meeting for board members and authorized personnel only," he snapped. I took an empty seat near Eleanor. "I'm authorized. I'm here as a shareholder representative." "That's impossible. You don't own shares." "Not personally," I agreed, opening my portfolio. "I'm here as the proxy representative for the Morris Family Trust." The room went still. Daniel's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and the first flickers of alarm. "The Morris Trust is a long-term investor," he said slowly. "They've never sent a representative before." "Things change," I replied, sliding my certification documents to Margaret. Victoria leaned forward, her voice sharp. "This is absurd. You were terminated. You have no place here." "My employment status and my shareholder rights are separate matters," I said calmly. Chairman Reynolds cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should begin with formalities while this situation is clarified." Within minutes, Margaret confirmed what I already knew. "The documentation is in order. Ms. Morris holds valid proxy voting rights for the Morris Family Trust's 7% stake, effective as of April 17. The moment Daniel saw me officially recognized was the first time he ever really looked at me. Not through me, not past me, but at me, with an expression of dawning horror. The meeting proceeded with Daniel presenting Raskin Tech's quarterly performance, a glossy picture of success that bore little resemblance to reality. Revenue up, market share expanding. The Westmore deal presented as a certainty despite its precarious status. When he finished, I raised my hand. "I'd like to address the board regarding some discrepancies in the financial presentation." Reynolds nodded cautiously. "The floor recognizes Ms. Morris." I stood, feeling surprisingly calm. "Thank you. Before I begin, I'd like to distribute some materials." I handed my prepared packets to Margaret, who distributed them. As board members began reviewing the contents, expressions of shock spread across their faces. "What is this?" demanded Victoria, her voice rising. "An itemized record of misconduct at Raskin Tech over the past 5 years," I replied evenly. Page 1 details the misappropriation of company funds for personal expenses. Page 2 shows systematic inflation of quarterly projections. Page 3 contains documented instances of discrimination and harassment that were deliberately buried. Daniel's face had gone pale. "This is slander." "Everything is documented," I interrupted. "Emails, financial records, witness statements, all authenticated." I turned to page 4. This section shows the pattern of nepotism, culminating in the creation of a position for Victoria's niece immediately after eliminating my redundant role. Chairman Reynolds studied the documents with growing alarm. "These allegations are extremely serious." "I can confirm several of these issues," James Fitzpatrick interjected. "I've been concerned about the leadership direction for some time." "As have I," added Eleanor Hughes. "The employee turnover alone should have triggered greater oversight." Victoria slammed her hand on the table. "This is ridiculous. You're all going to listen to an administrative assistant with a vendetta?" I met her gaze calmly. "I'm Jonathan Morris's daughter." The statement landed with devastating impact. The older board members, who had known my father, stared at me with new recognition. "Jonathan was one of our founding investors," whispered Reynolds. "He always did play the long game." Daniel pushed back from the table. "Even if these allegations had merit, which they don't, what exactly are you hoping to accomplish? One disgruntled shareholder can't change company direction." "Ordinarily, that would be true," I acknowledged. "But after discussing these findings with several major shareholders, I've secured enough additional proxy votes to call for a vote of no confidence in the current CEO and COO." As if on cue, Margaret's phone buzzed. She checked it, then looked up with surprise. "I've just received proxy transfer notifications from 3 institutional investors, combined with Ms. Morris's shares and those held by board members Hughes and Fitzpatrick." She calculated quickly. "That's 51% of voting shares aligned against current management." The silence in the room was absolute. Daniel stood, his composure finally cracking. "This is a coup, a calculated attack, orchestrated by someone you thought was furniture," I finished for him. "Someone quiet, Unseen, always available. Someone completely replaceable. When the final vote hit the table, the result was decisive. Daniel was ousted as CEO, effective immediately. Victoria's position was eliminated entirely, and a motion was passed to review Cassandra's qualifications for her newly created role. The moment the chairman announced the results, Daniel's face drained of all color. Victoria started to protest, but was silenced by the chairman's raised hand. "The board has spoken," Reynolds said firmly. "Security will escort you both to clear out your offices." As Daniel passed my chair, he paused, his voice barely audible. "How long have you been planning this?" I looked up at him, meeting his eyes directly. 9 years, 7 months, and 24 days. The silence that followed was delicious. 3 months after what company insiders now refer to as the Friday revelation, I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of what had once been Daniel's office. The view of Manhattan was the same, but everything else had changed. The nameplate on the door no longer read Daniel Kirkland, CEO. Instead, it simply stated Lena Morris, board advisor. I had declined the CEO position when it was offered, much to everyone's surprise. I wasn't interested in running the company day to day. My talents and interests lay elsewhere. "The quarterly numbers are in," said Anthony Rivera, the interim CEO we'd appointed from our development division. "Revenue is stabilizing after the initial dip, and employee retention is up 34% since the transition." I turned from the window and gestured for him to take a seat. "And the Westmore implementation?" "Ahead of schedule," he reported with a smile. Harold Westmore called personally to say how pleased they are with the transparency of our new approach. After Daniel and Victoria's ousting, we'd gone back to Westmore with a revised, honest timeline and pricing structure. To everyone's surprise, Harold had appreciated the candor and recommitted to the partnership on more realistic terms. "I'd rather work with a company that tells me hard truths than comforting lies," he'd said. "Excellent," I said, taking my own seat behind the desk that still felt too large for me. "And how's the cultural transition proceeding?" Anthony's expression turned thoughtful. "It's a process. Some departments are embracing the changes faster than others. The old guard is still adjusting." I nodded, unsurprised. Organizational culture doesn't transform overnight, especially one as deeply entrenched as Roskin-Tech's had been. The changes we'd implemented were significant. The anonymous whistleblower program allowed employees to report ethics violations without fear of retaliation. The new Employee Equity Initiative granted stock options at all levels, not just to executives. Performance reviews now included assessments of collaboration and mentorship, not just individual achievement. Some of Daniel's closest allies had resigned in protest or followed him to his new venture, a startup that was reportedly struggling to gain traction. Victoria had attempted to sue for wrongful termination, but withdrew the case when our attorneys countered with the evidence I'd compiled. As for Cassandra, Victoria's niece, she'd been given a fair performance review and reassigned to a position better suited to her actual qualifications: junior marketing associate rather than strategic director. To her credit, she was working diligently to prove herself on her own merits. "There is one personnel matter we should discuss," Anthony said, interrupting my thoughts. "Bradley Thompson has requested reinstatement." I raised an eyebrow. "Bradley? That's surprising. What's his reasoning?" "He claims he was misled by poor leadership and wants to be part of Roskin-Tech's exciting new chapter." Anthony's tone made it clear what he thought of this sudden conversion. I suppressed a smile. "And your recommendation?" "I think his talents would be better utilized elsewhere. His department's performance has actually improved under interim leadership." "I agree," I said. "Send him a polite but firm rejection. Suggest we can provide a reference if he's looking elsewhere." As Anthony left, my assistant, yes, I did have one now, reminded me of my lunch meeting with Eleanor Hughes. I found Eleanor waiting at our usual corner table at Thornton's, looking remarkably unchanged from our first clandestine meeting 3 months earlier. "The prodigal daughter returns," she said warmly as I sat down. "How does it feel beyond the other side of the power equation?" "Surreal," I admitted. "Sometimes I still expect someone to ask me to fetch coffee." She laughed, then her expression turned more serious. "The board is unanimously pleased with the direction of the company. Your father would be proud, Lena." "I hope so," I said, feeling the familiar pang whenever my father was mentioned. I keep wondering if this is what he intended all along. Jonathan was clever, but even he couldn't have predicted exactly how things would unfold, Eleanor said. He gave you tools, you chose how to use them. We ordered lunch, discussing the upcoming board meeting and strategic initiatives. As we were finishing, Eleanor asked, "Have you heard from Daniel?" "Not directly," I replied. "His lawyer contacted ours about his severance package, but there's been no personal communication." "That's probably for the best," she said. Some egos never recover from this kind of fall. Back at the office, I found James Fitzpatrick waiting in my reception area, chatting amicably with my assistant. "James, I didn't know we had a meeting." "We don't," he said, rising. "I just wanted to drop this off personally." He handed me a small wrapped package. Inside was a beautiful fountain pen with the Raskin Tech logo, the original logo from when the company was founded, not the sleek, modern version Daniel had commissioned. "It was your father's," James explained. "He used it to sign his original investment agreement. I thought you might want it for the quarterly report signatures tomorrow." I felt a lump form in my throat. "Thank you, James. This means a great deal to me." After he left, I walked through the office, taking a deliberately different path than usual. I passed the development team huddled around a promising new project, nodding to several engineers who waved in recognition. I stopped by marketing, where a diverse group was brainstorming the company's rebranding campaign. I visited HR, where the new director was finalizing an expanded parental leave policy. Everywhere I went, the atmosphere was different from the tense, hierarchical environment I'd known for nearly a decade. People looked up when I entered. They smiled, they asked questions, and offered ideas. Some even knew my coffee preference now. Back in my office, I sat at my desk and opened my father's letter again, the one I'd found with the trust documents all those years ago. The paper was worn from repeated readings, but his words remained clear. "Lena, power isn't about who shouts loudest or sits highest. It's about patience, observation, and choosing the right moment to act. I've given you a foundation. What you build on it is entirely up to you." I ran my fingers over his signature, now understanding why he'd structured my inheritance the way he had. He hadn't just left me shares in a company, he'd given me an education in human nature, corporate drama, and the true meaning of influence. The phone on my desk buzzed. "Miss Morris, the development team has a question about the new security protocol proposal. Do you have a moment?" "Of course," I replied. "Tell them I'll be right there." I placed my father's pen in my pocket and smiled. I had been the shadow behind the curtain for too long. Now I sat at the head of the table, visible and valued. And it turned out I had a lot to say.